happening now. Right, well, welcome everybody to the Handheld Book Club. Tonight we're going to be talking about British Weird, which is this book here. The editor is James Machin. James, could you wave your hand so everyone can see you? And in conversation with James, we have Tim Jarvis from University of Bedfordshire. Tim, could you wave your hand so people can see who you are? Because I can't see you at all because I've got speaker view up. What we're going to do, Tim and James are going to have a discussion, and I might interject now and again. And then after about half an hour, 35, 40 minutes, then we'll throw questions, well, throw the floor open to questions, as they say. If you would like to type a question into chat, Kat, who is helping me moderate, she will notice the chat questions and ask this, she will bring them up. Or at the time, you can stick your hand up and we'll see if you can speak to James and Tim directly. So, Tim, I hand the show over to you. Please carry on.
Thanks, Kate. That's great. Well, I guess I want to start by asking James, asking you a quick question really about where this all came from. I'm guessing for most people who are watching the, British Weird Selected Stories, 1893 to 1937, be fairly self-explanatory, but there might be some people not sure what sort of stories are contained in this volume, and it's a fantastic set of stories. It's really great. It's really engaging. There's some well-known and fantastic sort of essential tales, and then some much more obscure things in here as well. That sort of brilliant discoveries. So, can you say a little bit, James, about where this the idea for this book came from, and what sort of things people can expect to find in it?
I think, well, I can certainly do my best to answer that. I think Kate will probably have to chip in at some point as well. But it emerged from my my academic work. My PhD, which I did a few years ago, was on British Weird, and that was partly in response to the idea of weird being a genre or not a genre, or a label anyway, applied to sort of various forms of supernatural writing. About 10 years ago, especially, that was very much in the air and had gained some sort of traction. And going back further to the 90s, there was the new weird. So I won't go into that now, although I could do a little bit. But there seemed to be a lot of academic interest in the idea of weird fiction about 10 years ago. My supervisor, Roger Luckhurst, Birkbeck, really encouraged me down that sort of route to look at some of my favourite writers like Arthur Machen and so on. And that was the sort of frame we chose to use. And in America, there were people like Joshi and the Vandermeers who were using the word weird a lot in relation to literature. But I sensed a kind of focus on America as the crucible of weird fiction, and I wanted to redress that slightly with my own research, and also, based on Lovecraft's own critical writing. His modern masters of weird fiction weren't his contemporaries at Weird Tales magazine, who he had, normally had a certain amount of disdain for, but they were people like M.R. James, Arthur Machen, Lord Dunsany, and so on. So I wanted to explore that a bit. And Kate, I approached Kate, I think originally on John Buchan business, because John Buchan was one of my British weird writers. I was, I needed some help with something or other. I can't quite remember, but that's how I got in touch with Kate originally. And then Kate got wind of my monograph when that was published a few years ago.
Yeah.
And Kate, you suggested basically that it might make the basis of an anthology.
Yeah, because I reviewed the monograph, and reviewing the monograph made me think, well, there are almost no women in this monograph, and that set up the Women's Weird series, which we've done 2 volumes of now. But at the same time, I definitely was interested in a selection of British weird, so you were the obvious person to ask. and it just worked really well. It was a wonderful journey of discovery for me, and
for me too. Yeah.
well, you kept chucking authors at me, and I kept saying no, don't like that one. No, have you tried women? Have you thought about writing about women? Women in the weird. So we stretched each other's boundaries in that way.
Yeah.
I was going to say it's a the from the period. I mean, it's a broad span. I don't know. Oh, actually, there's probably James. Can you say something a little bit about why the period? Why 1893 to 1937? Because that seems to be really important to the shape of the anthology as well.
Yeah, I mean, that goes back to what I said about Lovecraft and his modern masters were those, writers who were starting out at the end of the 19th century, where there was this sort of explosion of supernatural short fiction for lots of different reasons. Some of them very sort of pragmatic reasons to do with just the explosion of the printed word, journals and literary magazines and so on, which all needed content. And the short story form especially was emerging at that time, or being experimented with at that time, and was a perfect form to fill the pages of these magazines, there were more of these magazines because of printing taxes. And there was also less censorship for various reasons, which I won't go into huge amounts of detail about now. But basically, Lovecraft's modern masters all emerged at that time, so that seemed the obvious starting point. And in terms of sort of period, the Second World War seems an obvious finishing point. I wanted to cover a bit more of the field into the 20s and 30s, because I think that is a little sort of overlooked. And then there's also another very practical reason, which is all the stuff coming out of copyright, all the stuff we can use easily without paying, vast amounts to various estates. So that was a, very practical reason. So it's, and also I wanted to get slightly away from this idea of the Victorian ghost story and look at it as more of a sort of early 20th century phenomenon as well.
Yeah, I know in your monograph, and this is something that you picked up on, that's a term of S.T. Joshi's, the haute weird, he calls it, doesn't he? There's a sort of
that's either Mieville, China Mieville, or S.T. Joshi. I can't actually quite remember who came up with that.
And is there a reason why do you think that the weird, maybe we'll get on to in a minute what exactly the weird is in terms of this anthology, but is there a reason why the weird emerges at this time? This anthology is focusing on a particularly kind of productive or prolific period for this mode, isn't it?
Yeah. There's lots of ways of answering that question, all probably interrelated. I can't give you a sort of categorical answer. I can suggest just a few things, like at the starting point of the anthology, like the late 19th century, the neat boundaries between the sciences and psychic phenomena and the occult weren't those Chinese walls there, which there are now. And also there weren't neat boundaries between genres of stories, and authors weren't sort of pigeonholed like that. And if a sort of author of social realist fiction wanted to try their hand at a supernatural story, there was no sort of risk to reputation or anything. There was no hierarchy of genres, and I think that encouraged a huge amount of experiment, I think, and also the idea of literary fiction itself was only just emerging. So there wasn't the snobbery there is now, I think, about genre fiction, and that encouraged people to just sort of mix stuff up, I think.
There was also a great interest in the occult in terms of the seance. And tried to talk to the dead. Because when I did my research in Edwardian magazines, you just kept tripping up over articles about how to have a seance, and seances debunked, as though this was completely normal, and everybody, of course, knew someone who would hold seances down their street. It was just part of the common culture.
Yeah. And if you look at the autobiography of Arthur Conan Doyle, he, he came up with the great rationalist, materialist Holmes. He was involved in seances all his life, and also, got approached by the Occult Society of the Golden Dawn as a possible member. All these people moved in the same circles, and there wasn't really the stigma attached to the occult and spiritualism that there is now. It was all part of reality, I suppose, for some people. It's interesting, actually, because in Mary Butts's essay, she talks about the previous century, the 19th century, being this period of very didactic materialism. And she regards the time that she's writing, the 1920s and 30s, as a sort of enlightenment of actually going back to taking the supernatural seriously, by the way, which is
yeah, it's really, because obviously I think we think of the weird and H.P. Lovecraft and his sort of arch materialism and his complete disbelief in anything like a kind of supernatural or numinous, but this is a different set. I mean, that kind of comes on to the next question I kind of wanted to ask, which is, I think most people are probably familiar with that Lovecraft definition of the weird story, but there's a different kind of weird that emerges from the pages of this anthology. Have you got any thoughts, James, about what defines weird? What are people going to encounter in a classic weird tale from this era?
I think a common thread between this anthology and what Lovecraft was famous for is moving away from the traditional supernatural tropes of the Gothic, which can be very rooted in a sort of Judeo-Christian idea of good versus evil. Dracula being a good example, where you have traditional werewolves, vampires, ghosts, and so on, to playing around with ideas where you're not quite sure where the sense of the supernatural is coming. You can't quite place the supernatural. It's very much reliant on ambiguity and not fully realizing or detailing the manifestations of a supernatural which the protagonist is experiencing or encountering. And always, M.R. James is a great thing, again, of leaving that room for doubt and possibility that anything happened at all. I think another sort of defining feature is the idea of, in narratology, you'd call it catastrophe at the end of a narrative, the lack of resolution, and the fact that most of the time the protagonists in these tales are significantly reduced by the end of their encounter with the weird.
Yeah, there's definitely, all of the stories share a kind of narrative structure, don't they? There's a kind of loose narrative structure that runs through, and I think that must be through a lot of weird fiction, where something is kind of shown to be happening, but we never quite see what that is. There isn't a kind of end or conclusion. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, that was something I wanted to come on to later, but there is, most of these stories also could be called horror stories. There's a few ghost stories as well, but most of them are also kind of horror stories as well, and have an ending that resolves in a kind of a tragedy or a horror. But the last two stories in the book, Arthur Machin's N and Mappamundi by Mary Butts, they don't sort of deal in horror so much as they deal in the kind of the numinous or is that something that the weird can also encapsulate?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of its sort of key features, is that it straddles both, where it plays around with the intersections between horror and, or in much the same way as, you know, the Gothic sublime, I think. And yeah, in those two stories at the end that you mentioned, apart from the fact that in Mapamundi, you know, the American man disappears, presumably meeting some sort of nefarious end. Yeah, you're absolutely right. They rely very much on a register of wonder and sort of ecstasy, as Arthur Machin would call it, and that's something that people who've written about weird fiction, like China Miéville, right, as well. That you can have a weird tale which isn't a horror story.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Mm.
Yeah, it does, because it does make the anthology feel quite different from, say, an anthology of ghost stories. I mean, even ghost stories considered in that sort of more loose sense that, say, Robert Aikman might have used it for his Fontana anthologies. The N and Mapamundi especially have a different kind of feel, don't they?
Mm. Yeah, yeah.
I guess going back to the title, I know, you know, it's kind of emerged from your academic research and stuff, but is there something distinct, you think, about the British weird fiction of this period that makes it different from the kinds of decadent experiments that were going on the continent, or the you know, the pulp sort of cosmic fictions of the Weird Tales set? Is there something different about the British?
That's yeah, that's a. I should have a response to that on my my fingertips, but I'd have to think about that. I think, you know, in terms of French and continental supernatural writing, there isn't that sort of ostentatious artiness, I don't think, in what's in British weird. There's a sort of brisk engagement with sort of the short story, as in the something that a reader on the omnibus is going to want to read in his magazine on the way home from work. There's that sort of a consciousness that they're doing a job of entertainment, basically, as well, which my sense from some of the continental decadent stuff is that you don't get. But as Kate will confirm, I did want to have some of the more British decadent writing in this anthology, but those were some of the stories that she nixed, probably for good reason. You know.
I didn't think they were very readable.
Yeah.
They were very much of their period. The Crimson Weaver is the one. Is that Gilchrist?
Yeah, that is. Yeah. Yeah.
I just couldn't get my head around it. I'd rather read Mallory. I mean, I'm perfectly happy reading antiquarian, but when it's fake antiquarian, it does not work for me. And I have to consider, is this going to sell? And it just seemed to jar so much with the extreme realism and practicality of Edith Nesbit. Even the Willows, which is a very practical story until you bring in the aliens.
Yeah.
And
the Willows, of course, started off from had its origins in a real canoe trip that Algernon Blackwood took down the Danube, and then wrote up as a sort of travel piece for a magazine, and then he reworked it for the Willows, introducing this supernatural element. So hence that really nice balance of documentary realism with this edge of the sinister creeping in from somewhere.
Yeah, and two story fees out of one experience. That's very practical.
Yeah.
I mean, I think, is that something that's distinctive about the weird? I was thinking that I really like that Gilchrist story as well, but it's kind of got a Dunsanian kind of fantasy to it. It's interesting talking about people, you know, people doing things. I think I mentioned to you, James, but I was going through some weekly tale tellers from 1909 looking for stories by another author, and I came across a very romantic, kind of straightforward, romantic story by Gilchrist. So he was obviously writing in a range of different modes, and it's interesting.
Yeah.
He wrote something that was so kind of out there and decadent and surreal was also, you know, earning his bread and butter, producing fictions for, you know, kind of housewife magazines and other things. So
entirely typical of the period.
Yeah. But it is,
of course, Arthur Machin wrote for what's the hot bedtime Horlicks magazine.
Yeah.
Produced some of his most sort of experimental writing, like the White People for Horlicks magazine, edited by Arthur Waite, the occultist. So
I think there were some other weird things in that as well, weren't there? Waite managed to sneak a load of stuff under.
Yeah, I think he had sort of fairly free reign to do that.
Yeah, that's it. So, I mean, I don't know if narrowing down, and I don't know whether it's helpful to narrow down definitions of the weird, but I guess the British weird is different from that, you know, the kind of continental weird of that period of, you know, think of Polish writers like Grabinski or Bruno Schulz, who are, they're in that Vandermeer anthology, but what they're doing is a completely different kind of weird. It's something very
more overtly symbolist, I guess.
Yeah.
On
that tradition.
And I think another difference with something like the Crimson Weaver or Dunsany is that it's very much second world fantasy. Whereas I think everything in this collection this anthology is very much the real. It's the real world where, as John Buchan would say, there's a crack in the universe, and you know something comes through.
So I think at the time there was a vogue in historical fiction for the antiquated discourse, and even things like Baroness Orczy and the Scarlet Pimpernel, where you have a deliberate return to a past which is not really the real past, but it's let me take you into the past and we can have a lovely wallow in this the period costume, period vocabulary. And I think the Crimson Weaver spins off that. It goes in a different direction, but it uses that taste, that acculturation to the past as a place of escape and adventure and so on.
Yeah, so it would have been, I think it would have been, I think you made the right decision, Kate. I think it would have been jarring in this table of contents. But I happily admit that everything in here sort of appeals to a particular sort of aesthetic, of which I regard as British weird, which I just happen to like. And lots of people would have, you know, different views on that. So,
I mean, I think I was going to ask you a question about what couldn't be sort of fitted in, but I think I'll run on to a question which I had been thinking about, is that there is, you know, it's not just, there's not just a collection of weird stories from this period. There are very strong sort of themes that emerge, and like you've sort of carefully curated the anthology as to emphasize a couple of particular features of the fiction of the period, which I think works really well. And one of the threads that runs through right from the Buchan story at the beginning, No Man's Land, is that of atavistic survivals. In fact, even in the Nesbit story, you've got this sort of sense that I don't want to spoil that story, but there are some pirates or some sort of buccaneers from the past who are sort of evoked in the narrative.
There's a Catholic past, I think.
And so that sense of kind of lost races hiding in the hills, or ancient folk rituals that persist into modern times, kind of runs through the story. Did you find that was a particular trope?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a completely sort of almost immediately identifiable trope, born of much wider anxieties of the time that, you know, to put it in very straightforward terms, British Empire was at its height, perhaps, and there was this sort of complacent assumption that we deserved to be top of the world, and the obverse of that are all these terrible anxieties that actually, you know, there were these atavistic impulses, you know, degrading us as a nation, degrading the race, and that we might, you know, slide back at backsliding, as you call it. that we might regress into some more primitive, dark, superstitious past and lose our status in the world. And I think a lot of these stories really articulate that anxiety.
Yeah, that's really, because I think because there is that whole thread, isn't there? You've got obviously, Hyde as the primitive or the atavistic coming out in the modern man in Jekyll and Hyde, and even something like Heart of Darkness, the idea of Kurtz being sort of touched by the wilderness. But there is something a little bit different about this. That I know you've talked about this, James, before, but the idea of and it's something that I know there were other Machin stories that you could have put in, because Machin was writing throughout the whole of this period, and you've chosen a story from later in his life, which I think is one of his best stories. But you could have put in one of his early stories that dealt with this idea of the humorist notion that the stories of the little people or the fairy folk were based on some kind of factual reality of a kind of Aboriginal British race that persisted in the hill. And that, I don't know if that is slightly different from that fear of the the collapse of the colonial,
I don't know. I mean, I didn't put one of those Machin stories in. I kind of instead, there's no man's land there, just because I thought that's more interesting to use a more unread John Buchan story, which did pretty much the same thing as one of those Machin stories, although in a very different way. But yeah, sure, you can join the dots there between No Man's Land, which appeared in Blackwood's magazine just straight after or straight before Heart of Darkness, and you can see the common themes in Heart of Darkness with again just this anxiety that these colonialists are walking around telling themselves that they're the apex of humanity, actually finding out that that's not the case at all, and that at any moment they could backslide or regress psychologically, or find out that actually their ancestors are not what they would have them be.
I mean, that Buchan story is really interesting in lots of ways, because it has that adventure quality of the encounter with the survival is, there's nothing supernatural about that. Machin made his little people sort of sinister and supernatural, and with kind of
always off screen with Machin.
But there's something in that story. When I read it, it struck me that the other thing that Buchan there's an anxiety about is an anxiety about almost about supernaturalism, because the story, without spoiling it, the story presents a scientist who is ruined when physical, manifest evidence is presented and is not seen as credible, and his reputation is ruined by this. There seems to be a failure of a kind of empirical, kind of reason, or a project to observe and understand. That's, kind of lead the real sort of horror of the story is actually that people don't believe this guy, and he loses his mind because he can't convince people. I don't know, sort of,
I mean, it's a variation on the sort of classic M.R. James trope of the skeptical rationalist being undone by it being demonstrated that he's got it completely wrong.
Except in Buchan's story, he's right, but people don't believe him. He even presents, doesn't he, evidence of the existence of these survivals, and it just
and that's where the horror comes in, because the narrative voice has proved to the reader that there is something out there, and although his peers have said, "Oh no, don't be ridiculous," the reader knows better, because we've been there, we've been in the cave, we've seen what they do.
It's, I mean, it is differently inflected from the Machin take on it, and it is something, I don't know, there's been quite a few recent narratives that pick up on that. I think like in horror cinema, like The Descent
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
Tomahawk, that
Yeah.
are basically kind of, that's their
Yeah.
text, isn't it? No Man's Land. It's really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a fairly sort of understandable fear that actually, that is really us somehow. Though that is, it's like the id personified, I think. There's also Robert E. Howard in the 1930s did his own take on the Machin Little People, which are remarkably similar to John Buchan's take in No Man's Land, but I don't know if Robert E. Howard, Robert E. Howard, who wrote Conan and so on in Weird Tales, I don't know if he was familiar with John Buchan's take. But Robert E. Howard being Robert E. Howard, it ends with pistols being drawn and so on, because you have to be tough in the face of these horrors.
I mean, he's one of the Weird Tales writers that's most in line with that British take, because there's a lot of the stories in his more kind of real world weird stories, isn't he? Because there are the colonial adventure stories as well, where the treasure produces.
Is this Howard you're talking about?
Yeah, and
right.
The kind of, was it Pigeons from Hell, which is the Southern Gothic
Yeah, he does a lot of Southern Gothic stuff, which stands up today, I think.
And so my sort of follow-up to that question was, this idea of the resurgence of the past, as you say, it's like almost, it maps onto the emergence of psychoanalysis as a discourse, doesn't it? In that time, the idea of the return of the repressed, but also building on the Gothic and the idea of the Gothic as a resurgence, either of a kind of feudal barbarity or a kind of a haunting of in the ghostly tale of someone who's died and comes back. But is that kind of return that's written into the Weird Tale of this era, is it differently inflected, do you think, from the sort of Gothic resurgence?
I think the Gothic generally, depending on your definition of the Gothic, but the sort of classic Gothic, the period of the classic Gothic novels, it's certainly a sort of pre-scientific or pre-modern past they're talking about. They're talking about the pre-Reformation past normally, whereas I think with the British Weird Tale of the period that is represented by this anthology, it's the post-evolutionary science deep parts. The mid-19th century advances in understanding of deep geological time and evolutionary science. It's a much, much deeper past, a more obscure past, and a past which completely eliminates the sort of Enlightenment idea of man being the measure of all things. I think in the sort of classic Gothic, man is still the measure of all things, whereas in this sort of later 19th century and onwards Weird Tale, man definitely isn't the measure of all things. There's no sort of Da Vinci Adam standing at the center. These are encounters with the world without us, as Eugene Thacker would call it, the theorist Eugene Thacker would call it. So I think that's maybe a difference, I think.
Okay, that's interesting. So it sort of emerges from the same sorts of despair that maybe are behind, say, Dover Beach or
Yeah, definitely, absolutely, yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah, because you do get that. There is a despair in a lot of these stories, more so than horror. I think that the main affect is a kind of despair.
Stopping short of the sort of nihilism associated with some later weird fiction like Ligotti and so on. Or Lovecraft even. Yeah. Although I would argue that Lovecraft always maintains that sort of ecstatic angle to his writing, which undercuts his sort of dour nihilism. Yeah,
Lovecraft's always excited by the possibility of the thing that he detests.
Yeah. He kind of always celebrates it in a way, even while he's...
It's that end of the Shadow over Innsmouth where the narrator is obviously like quite thrilled to be turning into a fish person and not really horrified as
He says he's going to dwell in glory and wonder forever and ever. How nice.
Yeah, I mean that's the ecstatic. I mean, I think I don't know if there's a better ending in. This is going to sound like a really grand claim, and I don't want to spoil it at all. But I don't know if there's a better ending in short fiction than the ending of Machin's N, which has this kind of incredible intertwining of the numinous and the horrific into this one sort of figure that's really odd. Really.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. It sort of it leaves you wondering, wonder with a capital W, and then you get completely creeped out by it, and with what companions? Sorry for the spoiler, but not that you. Yeah,
it's not really a spoiler, is it? But
no.
Yeah, I'm sure most people or many people have read it. But yeah, that's the other thing I was going to sort of ask about, which is another thread that you seem to have kind of deliberately woven through the anthology, which is this thread of, and it's something that comes up in the Mary Butts essay. She talks about quite a bit the idea of temenoi, kind of sacred places, and those genii locorum that are the presiding spirits of these places. And there's a number of the stories that do that, and it kind of ends with that double whammy of London and Paris in Machin's N and Butts's Mappamundi that do this thing where the urban space becomes another space. Was that something you found coming up a lot when you were reading for?
Yeah, and as you've mentioned, Mary Butts identified it as such writing in the 1920s. And if you read The Willows, the actual word Temenos is there in The Willows. It's there in a lot of John Buchan's short stories. And it was used as this sort of motif, as in this, I hate to use the word, but liminal space where different realities intersect and different conceptions of reality intersect. And again, Mary Butts writes very nicely about it in terms of, I think, again, to mention his name, John Buchan, again, where she talks about different moves on a chessboard, where the reality we know that a pawn will move 2 spaces forward, but there's another reality where it's the knight's move of the L shape round, and it's those 2 weird realities intersecting. And the classic, the classical concept of the Temenos, the sacred grove, again, at the forefront of people's minds at that time, specifically because of Fraser's The Golden Bough and so on. Definitely a common motif, and a useful one to them, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting that it's so present in those 2 stories, and I wonder if both Machin and Butts had a belief in a kind of supernatural. I know Machin didn't believe in ghosts. Mary Butts seems to have believed in ghosts and to have encountered ghostly apparitions. Machin had a broader belief in kind of an ideal realm or something beyond the veil. And
Machin was a deeply, deeply religious man, to the extent where he thought the metaphysical reality, as he saw it, was the only reality, and the material world was a sort of shadow play. But also combine that with this sort of very sniffy contempt for, middle class seances, and also he was very rude about. He joined the Golden Dawn, one of the preeminent cult societies of the day, for a few weeks, and is quite rude about it in his memoirs, and said that he didn't learn anything from it at all, and quite disparaging about it. So he combined this quite hard-edged cynicism about his contemporary occult scene with a completely occult worldview of his own.
Yeah, and it really comes across, I think, in those 2 stories. I mean, that might be another kind of difference, that there is a difference between the kind of the numinous that you get from a writer who has a kind of belief in something else, and the worldview of Lovecraft and that he spread amongst his contemporaries in the weird tale set of that bleak and kind of rational materialist view of the universe, where the supernatural is represented by kind of giant entities that have come from the far reaches of the cosmos, rather than this kind of slippery, in this kind of slippery, Edenic kind of fragment of creation that can be molded by the minds of those who have an affinity for it, which is something very, very different, and it does feel more ecstatic, doesn't it? That ecstatic sublime is very different. The other sort of temenoi or temenos, is that, and it's a story that I'd never come across before, which is really great. Randalls Round by Eleanor Scott, which seems to prefigure all kinds of what people have called in the last few years folk horror from the 1970s, in depicting a kind of an ancient ritual in a small, sleepy Chilterns, or Cotswolds, isn't it? Cotswolds village, where this rite is still practiced. Was that unique? That kind of folk horror-y? I know there are other sort of things from the time that do similar things, like.
Yeah, I mean, in the introduction, I mentioned John Buchan's The Dancing Floor, which is a sort of novel folk horror.
But isn't Horace Walpole as well? Horace Walpole was, hang on, wrong Horace, the wrong Walpole. Help.
Hugh Walpole.
Hugh Walpole, thank you. Hugh Walpole was parodied for writing tales of ritual murder in an ordinary cathedral town. And I haven't read enough of his fiction to track down the original, but his novels sold in vast amounts. So he may have tapped into that as well.
Yeah. There's also Grant Allen, his story, it's a barrow in the title. I can't remember the full name of the story. But that again, shares a lot of the tropes. But you say common, but thinking about it, actually, nothing as stark as, I'm forgetting Witchwood, of course, by John Buchan, more so even than
That's set in the past.
That is set in the past. You're right.
And
that is set in the
Katie's
past.
just given us, it's Pallinghurst Barrow.
Pallinghurst, thank you, Katie. But nothing as sort of completely on point folk horror as Randalls Round by Eleanor Scott, where you just read it and you think this is exactly what Mark Gatiss was talking about in that documentary, in which he, it really is. Slotted together Witchfinder General and The Wicker Man and Blood on Satan's Claw. So it's astonishingly
uplifting tone. I think it's time to throw questions open. I mean, would anyone like to type a question in the chat to James about the book? While you're thinking, I have a question. There is very little about working class and the weird, from what I can make out. Was it really a kind of story that was really for the educated man about town, or the man who had a job and a family to support? Because I think the Lewis story that you uncovered is the only instance I've ever come across of true working class setting and protagonist in a weird milieu.
I found that review of the E. Nesbitt story, the collection that was in originally, and the reviewer at the Times complaining about how all the protagonists of these sort of stories seem to be, I think they use the phrase, irredeemably middle class. And of course, after the, part of the reason for the explosion of print media at the time was the Education Act of 1870, which really expanded the reading public. So there was, a wider breadth of, it wasn't an educated elite reading these stories or writing them. But yeah, there is, it's not, there's not an abundance of working class protagonists
No.
Oliver Onions, who we unfortunately couldn't fit in,
Mhm.
he wrote stories with very working class protagonists. In the collection, which I think I'm right in saying, yeah, the John Metcalfe collection, which the Badlands is from, there is a sort of much lower class, working class milieu
Yeah.
that some of those are set in.
Where money might be a problem.
Yeah.
Quite obvious that in the Benson story and all the others, money is not a problem.
No, these are all sort of gentlemen,
Yeah.
amateurs, and
But in
yeah,
Lewis's
mostly
stuff, it's the
gentlemen.
money. Yeah.
Yeah.
We have a question from Sandra saying, "Can you tell us a bit more about Mary Butts? I thought her essay and story have a really distinctive voice."
Yeah, I'm not a Mary Butts scholar, but she's somebody that I'm, gaining an increasing interest in because I think she's brilliant.
We published a Mary
All
Butts
fiction in
story in
print.
Women Weird.
Yes, there's that great story With or Without Buttons, which is a brilliant ghost story. She had a sort of fascinating life. She associated with lots of bohemian and artistic circles on the continent and in England. She was deeply involved in the occult as well. She was an associate of Aleister Crowley and stayed in Crowley's notorious villa in Cefalù in Sicily, and co-wrote occult material with him. But she was also very much involved in the sort of modernist scene as well. I think people like Origin and so on. So a really interesting. She died quite young and was then seemed to sort of be almost immediately forgotten, which is a real shame. But yeah, I mean, she was incredibly productive in her lifetime. But I don't know much more about her than that, unfortunately.
Yeah, she's more of a figure in the modernist side, I think. And that's where I came across her. And I think American scholarship has republished her letters and diaries and fragments of uncollected work as a modernist figure.
Right.
And the occult side of her interest is regarded as a bit of an aberration, a bit taking modernism to an extreme. Which is one way of regarding her. But it would be wonderful to have a collection of her fantasy or her weird writing. That would be amazing. So I'm open to suggestions, anyone who wants to edit one. Carl asks, did we consider any William Hope Hodgson?
I did, and I think you mentioned him as well, Kate. I think he tilts towards science fiction, the sort of H.G. Wellsian science fiction, a bit too much, and that's why I didn't think he fitted. But there are probably stories which could have worked very well.
Yeah, the name is familiar, so I know I've read him, but I cannot bring one story to mind.
I mean, the story I would have wanted to put in there was the House on the Borderland, but it's more of a novel than a story, so that wouldn't have been an option.
And we already had to throw out a fantastic story because it was way too long.
Yeah,
so,
we had to get rid of all to do.
Space was a real problem.
Yeah.
So yes, we did, sort of, I think.
It's like slotting together a jigsaw, basically, in terms of taking into account these sort of practical ideas about word count and sizes and the stories working together and fitting together and what's in copyright and what's out of copyright.
Yeah, what can we afford? Yeah. Abby asks, you mentioned liminality. Is this a key trope of the weird, the idea of the borderline?
Yes, I think absolutely it is. Yeah. I think I sort of see from Twitter that the word liminality has fallen out of favor with various people as being too as being an academic cliche. I'm probably unfairly, I think. But yeah, definitely, I think because these stories are sort of rooted in the real world, in reality, then anything that sort of destabilizes that is the sort of source of some of the horror and the effect of the stories. And to do that, you have to have this borderland where reality unravels a little bit and meets something else.
And the vagueness, the insubstantiality of it is what produces the horror. Whereas if you have a actual physical border, a portal from one world to another, well, then you're into fantasy, which is a little bit different.
That's a
So
really good point.
the fuzzy liminality, that does sound key to me.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good point. There's no distinct wardrobe for people to walk through into Narnia. It's more sort of vague and complicated than that.
The mist creeps up from your ankles and then you're doomed because suddenly you're in it. Yes. Strange. Yeah. I have another question. We already tackled this a little bit in the launch for British Weird and Women's Weird back in October. Difficulties of racism in weird fiction of the period. Melissa Edmondson and I had real difficulty trying to work out, can we publish the story again, even though it has distinctive and very unpleasant racist overtones or usages. And some, she said, she just wouldn't consider at all, ever, because they were just unprintable now, because of we have a different understanding of culture and people and human rights and so on. Did you come across that when you were searching?
I didn't, but then again, I kind of know where to look, or when not to look, rather. I don't think you can have there's no sort of comprehensive answer to that, because it obviously, especially as an editor, it's personal tolerance of that sort of thing, and I'm actually not in, that's being who I am. That's really not my call. I just have to go on instinct and what I think is acceptable or not, and hope I don't get that wrong. I don't think there's anything in here which crosses any lines, although I'm sure plenty of it's problematic enough. But yeah, it's difficult to read anything written before the Second World War where you don't, suddenly read something and go, oh my God, what on earth were people thinking? It's just in the sort of fabric of the writing.
Yes, it's part of the culture, and that's why it's so difficult to find a story that has lasted well enough to be accepted on the strength of the writing. And then you just have to say, here's a racist bit, here's an anti-Semitic bit, accept it, this is part of what it was like at the time. You have to put the asterisks around it. We have a question from RMLP. Has H.G. Wells ever been included amongst weird writers?
I'm sure, almost certainly, and I sort of do myself, but I think his he had many strengths, but he's so sort of firmly associated with what then was emerging as science fiction. That's why I sort of steered clear from him a bit. So yeah, I mean, there are short stories which would definitely fit, I think.
Did we not consider one about a man going through a gate in a door?
Yeah. Is that Opening the Door? No, is that the Machin one? Tim, help me. Is that what's that called?
Door in the Wall.
Door in the Wall. That's right. Yeah.
That sounds right. Yeah.
I mean, that is definitely a weird tale.
Yeah.
But I mean, he's more. I was thinking something like the Sea Raiders is weird in much more in the American cosmic weird.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
It's not cosmic, but it's tentacled, jellyfish, and that sort of, and that a bit like Hope Hodgson, whose weirdness comes from funguses or fungi possessing people, or giant octopuses and things like that, rather than this kind of subtle. It's a different inflection, isn't it?
Men in contraptions.
Machine.
But yeah, and it tilts very much towards that weird tales American iteration of the weird, I think, which is possibly why I avoided it.
The questioner said The Strange Case of Davidson's Eyes. Does that ring bells to you?
I don't know that one.
I don't know that one. No, is that right?
I should mention that in terms of H.G. Wells, I think something that is genuinely weird that he wrote quite late was The Croquet Player, which is a really genuinely sort of strange and unsettling and subtle late novel of his, which definitely fits with this sort of aesthetic.
I think I may have read that actually. Yes, I have read that. You're right, but it's way too long. We could never have considered it. Okay, I think we're nearly up to our hour, because it's well known that an hour of Zoom is about all anyone can tolerate. Are there any final questions before we wrap up? No? Yes? No? Okay, well, I will thank you. Thank you very much, James, for giving us your time.
Thank you.
Tim,
Thanks, Susan.
for feeding the questions and
Yeah, thank
thinking
you.
this through and giving it a framework. And thank you all for attending. I hope you'll come back to another Handheld Book Club. Right, thank you. Thank you all. I'm going to stop recording now.